Hey, greetings, everyone. Lieutenant Colonel Alan West, the Executive Director of the American Constitutional Rights Union and the ACRU Action Fund. And I want to welcome you to another episode of Live Free TV brought to you by the American Constitutional Rights Union. Visit us at theacru.org. That's theacru.org. And also visit and support our Committee to Support and Defend, which is our constitutional conservative veterans organization, because we believe that once you take that oath, to support and defend the Constitution of the United States of America against all enemies, foreign and domestic, that it has no statute of limitations. Well, speaking of the Constitution, it is what, round 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, I don't know how many times. The government shut down. I think it is getting to a point where most people saying, yeah, okay, so what, big deal. But right now, what we are seeing happening is that when you talk about the Constitution, the main thing that the Congress of the United States of America, their biggest constitutional duty and responsibility they're supposed to do is produce a budget. That means that they have to go through and pass 12 appropriations bills, 12 appropriations bills that tie to the funding of the United States government, the federal government. That happens in the House, goes over, that happens in the Senate. If there are differences, they call what is called a reconciliation, and they come together and they produce that final budget. When they don't produce the budget, then we have to go into these ongoing things called continuing resolutions, which means that they continue to fund the government, 6 weeks here, 2 months there, 3 months here. But what it always ends up is that at the end of the calendar year, not the fiscal year, but the end of the calendar year, what happens is that, well, we get this thing pushed through called an omnibus spending bill, which just I call it kind of like a fiscal spending gumbo, a little bit of everything thrown in there. And sadly, most people don't read it because, it's yay big. But if we don't start to hold the people in Washington, D.C. accountable to do the right fiscal thing, like you have to do in your private sector business, we will continue to see this, well, this charade, this kabuki theater, and it's really bad kabuki theater that continues to go on. Now, first of all, is the government really shut down? No, of course it's not. And what we've seen in prior, facades or escapades or episodes of this same thing called the government shutdown is that, yeah, there are some people that get furloughed. There's told us well, we're told that they are non-essential. Well, if they're non-essential, then why are they working for the federal government? But then what ends up happening is, eventually things are resolved. Maybe it takes a week, 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks. And then they all come back. And guess what? They get paid back pay for the time that they were quote unquote furloughed. That's not shutting down the government. See, what really needs to happen is first and foremost, we need to get back to a constitutional governance. We need to make sure that the Congress, and oh, by the way, are the members of the United States Congress, both House and Senate, are they still getting paid? Are their staff, they still getting paid? Well, then the government really hadn't shut down. But maybe we should ask ourselves, are they really essential? And when you think about it, go back to COVID and how interesting it was that we saw government entities that were deciding in the private sector, in the business world, who was essential and non essential, basically telling people that had put their whole lives behind building a business, small, medium, large, that they decided that they could shut it down. But yet, the government is deciding, in which something I don't see in the Constitution, there's an enumerated power to the government to tell private sector businesses or which private sector business can be open and can be shut. Or even when you go back and you look at the very First Amendment, the very first liberty we have in our First Amendment, our Bill of Rights, is the freedom of religion and the free exercise thereof. What does the government get the power to tell people at churches, you got to shut down? You can't have church. As a matter of fact, you cannot even meet in the parking lots and sit inside your car and have the right requisite spacing between your vehicles. If you do so, as we saw, I believe in Louisville, Kentucky, we'll take down your license plate. So I think we're kind of upside down when we talk about this government shutdown thing, because really, if the federal government is not enumerated has the power to be able to tell private sector businesses, and of course, like I said, certain small businesses and medium-sized businesses had to shut down, churches had to close down, but yet you could go get a Big Mac, you could go to McDonald's, you could go to Home Depot, you could go to a liquor store, you could go to, if you want to go and dismember an unborn baby in the womb, you could do that. So who are these people making this decision about who in the private sector can shut down? But then all of a sudden, when people start to talk about shutting down the government, then they go into an apoplectic meltdown. Maybe, just maybe, one day we should have people in the private sector, the people that pay the taxes so that the government can exist. But then, of course, the government wastes their taxpayer dollars. Maybe people in the private sector should determine who is essential and non essential in the federal government. But, kind of, the Constitution did that for us already. My handy dandy Constitution, Declaration of Independence, and Constitution that I carry with me wherever I go. And it's important that we go to Article 1, Section 8 of the United States Constitution, because there, Article 1, of course, provides the duties and responsibility of the legislative branch, Article 2 for the executive branch, Article 3 for the judicial branch. But when I go to Article 1, Section 8, it kind of lays it out what the enumerated powers, duties, responsibilities, purviews are for the federal government. The Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises, to pay the debts. They are not following the Constitution with that. And provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States. It seems to me they got it kind of backwards. They're supposed to make sure that we have that common defense, but they spend more time on the general welfare. But all duties, imposts, and excises shall be uniform throughout the United States, to borrow money on the credit of the United States, to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes, to establish a uniform rule of naturalization, immigration, and uniform laws on the subject of bankruptcies throughout the United States, to coin money, regulate the value thereof, and of foreign coin, and fix the standard of weights and measures. Well, we came up with this Federal Reserve thing, and they kind of took that over. To provide for the punishment of counterfeiting the securities and current coin of the United States, to establish post offices and post roads, to promote the progress of science and useful arts by securing for limited times to authors and inventors exclusive right to their respective writings and discoveries, patents, to constitute tribunals inferior to the Supreme Court. In other words, the Constitution only establishes one court, that's the Supreme Court. All other inferior courts or tribunals inferior to the Supreme Court, well, that's the responsibility of the Congress to do that. They're kind of failing. To define and punish piracies and felonies committed on the high seas and offenses against the law of nations. To declare war and grant letters of marque and reprisal and make rules concerning captures on land and water. To raise, maybe Barack Obama should not have just given away the 5 senior members of the Taliban unilaterally without congressional approval. To raise and support armies, but no longer appropriation of money to that use shall be for a longer term than 2 years. Constitutional basis for our defense here, to provide and maintain a navy, to make rules for the government and regulation of the land and naval forces, to provide for calling forth the militia to execute the laws of the Union, suppress insurrections, and repel invasions. Legal immigration, repelling invasions. It also ties back to Article 4, Section 4 of the Constitution. To provide for organizing, arming, and disciplining the militia, and for governing such part of them as may be employed in the service of the United States, reserving to the states respectively the appointment of the officers and the authority of training the militia according to the discipline prescribed by the Congress. Really and truthfully, the last one, to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States or in any department or officer thereof. Now, 18 things, that's what it really comes down to. 18 things in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. And all of those powers, not specifically designated to the federal government, are reserved to who? The states and to the people. And so when we look at how the federal government has just grown and expanded into so many various aspects of our lives. The question is it constitutional? I know a lot of people are upset about USAID. USAID was created by executive order in the Kennedy administration, so it can be dismantled by executive order, which is what we saw from the Trump administration. The Department of Education. Once upon a time, we had health, education, welfare, one department, one agency. Then all of a sudden, the teachers' unions wanted to have their own department. They went to Jimmy Carter at the time, and Jimmy Carter said, okay, no problem. Pass me some more peanuts. And now we get from HEW, we get Health and Human Services, Education, and Housing and Urban Development, HUD. So once we had one agency, and now we have three agencies. So this is what I think is so important we start to look at when we have these quote unquote government shutdowns. Is what really and truthfully are the constitutional duties, roles, functions, responsibilities, enumerated powers to the federal government? And if they're creating agencies and programs and things of this nature that are not in concert. And look, if you don't like it, there's an amendment process that our founding fathers came up with. And so you can, have an amendment. But to continue to go on and just say, oh, we're going to create another agency. Look, coming out of 9/11, we created the Department of Homeland Security. Well, could that function not have fallen under the Department of Defense? Just made it a separate thing about Homeland Security defense. So I think it's so important that in this time where most people aren't even paying attention to this thing called a government shutdown. And oh, by the way, are those members of the House and Senate and all those folks, are they still getting paid? I think I already asked that question. But I think it's an important thing. Because if the government is shut down, then what parts of the government are shut down? The parts that are not essential? Well, then if they're not essential, why do they exist? So we here at the American Constitutional Rights Union, we want to always ask the question from a constitutional perspective, from a constitutional basis, because that's our foundation, our rule of law. And if we don't begin to apply the Constitution, our rule of law, to every aspect of the operations of our federal government, just the same as we should be applying state constitutions to the operations of our respective states, then we will see ourselves devolve into, currently where we are, almost seemingly at a state of being rudderless. We don't want to see that happen, especially as we march toward our 250th anniversary of the longest running constitutional republic that the world has ever known. I decided to go back and read the book by David McCullough, 1776. I think every single one of us should go back and read that book and understand how this nation got its start. Understand how it stood up against the greatest military power that the world has ever known so that we can be living here today. And understand this incredible blessing of liberty that they left for us. That's why they made the sacrifices that they made. But if we continue to get further and further away from understanding those sacrifices, further and further away from the foundational documents, the principles and values that they left us with, if we don't safeguard those principles and values and we don't adhere to our rule of law and those principles and values, then we will find ourselves maybe not in a position to celebrate the 300th anniversary of this great nation. Wish I could be around. I don't think I will be. But I was there for the 200th. I'm here for the 250th. And then the 50 years in between, the things that we see happening now, I would have never thought would happen in this interim space between our bicentennial to where we are today. But that's why the ACRU is here. Visit us at theacru.org, because if someone is not standing up there to make sure that we adhere to the rule of law, then who will? That's why I enjoy this position. That's why I enjoy continuing to honor my oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States of America. God bless.